In a land of drought and silence, one man stood against a king. When the heavens closed, ravens carried bread. When a widow's hope was gone, her flour never failed. When death came, a child breathed again. But the true test was yet to come. On Mount Carmel, before thousands, Elijah faced 450 prophets of Baal. Their cries filled the air, their blood stained the stones, but no fire came. Then, one prayer, one voice, and fire fell from heaven. The people trembled, the rain returned, but the queen's fury rose like a storm. In the wilderness, Elijah found not fire, but a whisper, and in the end, a chariot of flames carried him beyond the skies. This is the story of fire, faith, and a God who answers.
What if I told you that one man defeated 450 Baal prophets by himself? The tale of Elijah is one of divine confrontations, fire from heaven, and unwavering faith. However, how did God use a single prophet to take on a wicked king and queen? The answer is found in a widow's final meal, a 3-year drought, and ravens that brought bread down from the sky. This is the little-known tale of Elijah's ascent from poverty to a national-shaking miracle on a mountaintop. Tell me your name, city, and the time of day you are viewing this in the comments section before we start. I would like to know who is here with us tonight, joining us in this spiritual journey. The description below contains a link to the complete Bible, which includes all 88 books, as well as the Book of Enoch, if you want to read Elijah's story for yourself. Let's go back to the beginning, when a prophet who walked with fire lived in a land that was dry due to drought. What if a single man's words had the power to change the course of an entire kingdom? With a statement that would send Israel into disarray, Elijah stood before King Ahab and said, "As the Lord lives, there will be neither dew nor rain these years, except at my word." The heavens immediately closed as he spoke. There was no warning thunderclap. No ominous clouds gathered to say goodbye. The earth started to dry out and the air became still. Israel was already a long way from God. Under Jezebel's leadership, Ahab, the weakest of its kings, constructed temples to Baal. The queen built altars where child sacrifices burned and brought priests from Sidon. People whispered that Baal was in charge of the storms and that harvests came from his favor. Barren fields cracked under the unrelenting sun during Elijah's drought, exposing the lie. Orchards turned to skeletons. Once rushing, the Kishon River now only trickles. Mothers gazed at empty storage jars while cattle lowed in hollow agony. Prayers were turned into entreaties to Baal out of desperation. Priests cut their arms while screaming for rain that never materialized. The earth grew drier as they bled more. Elijah disappeared in the meantime. Hated, pursued, and abandoned, the man who cursed the skies turned into a ghost. However, this was more than just a fight between dust and moisture. Unseen forces clashed, Jezebel's yelling idols and Elijah's silent God. Baal's claims were ridiculed every day by the sun. Every gulp of thirst was evidence of God's power. 3 years passed during the drought. The resilient died after the weak and livestock. Elijah was blamed for the ruin by Ahab's scouts, who searched the area for him. The prophet, however, wasn't hiding. He waited. This famine was a preparation as much as a punishment. Before Israel could acknowledge the one true God, it had to witness the failure of its gods. They would yearn for bread from heaven because the drought had etched hunger into their bones. However, Elijah was also mortal. He was not immune to starvation. How could even the prophet survive if the crops failed and the brooks dried up? At dawn, ravens came. They dropped chunks of meat and coarse bread next to Cherith's dying stream, their black wings piercing the haze. Legally prohibited filthy birds turned into divine caterers. The brook choked into mud as Elijah drank from it. Then the ravens ceased to arrive. Israel was brittle with need as a result of the drought. However, greater tests are always the result of miracles. In Zarephath, A widow would soon have to decide whether to share her final meal or watch her son go hungry. Elijah was just getting started on his trek to Mount Carmel. According to Levitical law, the raven is an unclean bird because it feeds on carcasses and is not permitted as food. However, God selected these very animals to support his prophet. When told to hide by the brook Cherith east of the Jordan, drought, Elijah now had to face his hunger there, by himself in the wilderness. The contradiction was glaring. In order to eat, the messenger of God's judgment required divine intervention. Black wings flitted through the mist of dawn every morning. Ravens showed up with rough barley bread and meat scraps in their beaks, which were probably stolen from army camps or far-off marketplaces. Their harsh cries announced the delivery of meals with unnerving precision, and they arrived twice a day. There were no crops growing close by, and Elijah had no pantry. He had to rely solely on animals that the Israelites shunned. In the most unlikely way, the God who denied a disobedient nation rain provided food for his servant. At first the brook supplied water, but each week its flow decreased. Elijah observed the transition of the stream bed from soggy soil to fractured mud. There was no rain to resupply it. His water supply failed because of the same divine hand that ordered ravens to feed him. Faith grows when familiar supports disappear, so this was no accident. The prophet was asked, "Do you really trust the one who sends unclean birds with your breakfast, with each dwindling trickle?" Ravens became symbols of corruption due to Jewish purity laws. Defilement was indicated by their presence at sacrifices. However, God used what was considered improper for rituals to create his preferred method of delivery. Elijah ate simple meals from the beaks of outcast birds, while Jezebel's priests feasted on temple offerings. The arrangement challenged religious presumptions about how and through whom God operates, going beyond simple physical sustenance. The regularity of the raven's visits became more shocking as the months went by. The bread and meat continued to arrive despite the intense heat and dry winds. A sort of miracle resulted from Elijah's obedience to stay by that dying brook. He had the option to depart, look for human assistance, or wonder why God didn't simply prolong the stream. Rather, he remained and watched as the water drained away, one drop after another, until nothing was left but dust. The ravens ceased to visit when the brook was totally dry. Their departure signified transition rather than abandonment. The first lesson Elijah had learned was that God rarely provides what we would expect. The test changed from depending on birds to coming across a widow in need. The belief that the God who commands unclean creatures can multiply a poor woman's last handful of flour would be necessary for both. Elijah was ready for more difficult challenges after Cherith's silent miracle. God showed that no resource is too valuable for him to use, and that no channel is too lowly for his purposes when he fed his prophet with ravens. When dealing with kings, false prophets, and national apostasy, the lesson would prove crucial. The man who would call down fire had to learn to rely on others in the wilderness before fire could reach Mount Carmel. When even miraculous provisions run out, where does assistance come in? Elijah believed that Zarephath, a Gentile town in Sidon, Jezebel's native land, held the solution. The widow there had no knowledge of the God of Israel. The prophet showed up at her gate just as she was about to starve. God's pattern was evident from unclean birds to a pagan woman. He provides for his servants by allowing them to experience the unexpected and unnoticed. The ravens were only the start. Elijah was instructed by God to depart from Cherith and travel to Zarephath, a town in Sidon, the homeland of Jezebel. This was illogical. Why, in the midst of a famine, send God's prophet to hostile territory? Elijah, however, complied and made his way to the city gates after walking miles through arid terrain.
"Bring me some
He
water,"
saw a widow
he said,
collecting
and as she
sticks
turned
there.
to get it, he added the unimaginable, "And bring me bread." The woman stopped. She gripped the sticks more tightly. She had hardly enough oil and flour left to prepare one last meal for her son and herself. Then they would go hungry. The grains kept in clay jars had long since run out, and Zarephath had been severely affected by the famine. This foreigner stranger was now requesting her final handful of flour. First,
Make a small loaf for me, then use the rest for you and your son, Elijah said, piercing her desperation. Until the day the Lord sends rain, the jug of oil and the jar of flour will remain full. She trembled her fingers. Sharing her final meal was a risky move. She and her child would perish sooner rather than later if this man had lied. But there was authority in his tone that went beyond desperation. She combined her small amount of flour with the remaining oil and baked bread, first for Elijah and then for herself and her son. The jar ought to have been empty that evening. However, flour was still stuck to the rim when she reached inside the following morning. After being almost empty the day before, the oil jug now gleamed with enough for another day. The miracle was repeated day after day. The oil and flour remained, scoop after scoop. In the midst of the famine, the widow's barely surviving home turned into an oasis. God now kept a desperate household alive with a handful of flour, just as he kept Elijah alive with ravens. The symbolism was powerful. A Gentile widow believed in God's word, while Israel, God's chosen people, chased idols. While a single woman's obedience kept her jars full, a nation with empty altars went hungry. However, faith is always put to the test. The widow's son became ill one day. His limbs became cold, and his breath became shells. Low. His body tensed, then completely stopped moving, and she watched helplessly. Anger turned into charges. "Man of God, did you come to remind me of my sins and kill my son?" she said, turning on Elijah. Elijah remained silent. He lifted the boy out of her arms, carried him to the room on the rooftop where he stayed, and placed him on the bed. Then, in an unexpected move, he stretched himself over the child 3 times and prayed to God, saying, "Give this boy his life back." The silence was broken by a gasp. His eyelids fluttered open as the boy shuddered. He was alive when Elijah carried him to his mother. The widow saw God's power in that moment, not just a prophet. Their bodies had been maintained by her jars of oil and flour, but this miracle gave her hope again. Elijah had made it through the drought, the ravens, and now an empty pantry belonging to a widow. However, his biggest test was yet to come. He would soon have to contend with the full power of Ahab's kingdom, as well as 450 prophets of Baal, in addition to starvation and death. What Israel itself would soon have to choose between, false gods and the one who makes flour multiply and the dead rise, was hinted at by the widow's faith. On the horizon was Mount Carmel. Before fire fell, Elijah faced the king directly. The boy developed a sudden fever. He was playing in the courtyard one minute, and then he was lying on his mat, burning. While Elijah's miracle flour remained in her jar, the widow of Zarephath watched his breath become shallow and applied cool cloths to his forehead. However, there was no miracle this time. The child became grey-skinned, then he stopped moving his chest. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come here to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" she yelled at Elijah, her words resonating in the air like dust outside. There were no explanations from the prophet. He just reached down, picked up the little body in his arms, and carried it up to his sleeping quarters. Then, as if to impart warmth, he stretched himself over the child 3 times, pressing his body against the dead body. There was no grand prophecy, no ritual formula, just the fervent prayers of a man who had witnessed God provide flour, but now faced death itself. "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him," he cried out between each covering. The boy shuddered as Elijah covered him for the 3rd time. He twitched his fingers. Then his lungs filled with air and he gasped. He was carried downstairs by the prophet, who raised his hip, alive. The widow's tears changed from sadness to wonder. She gripped her resurrected son and whispered, "Now I know you are a man of God." There was more to this moment than flour multiplying. God's prophet had triumphed over death itself. Before Jesus touched the bier and healed him, a widow's son would be carried out of Nain's gates centuries later. Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, followed the same pattern. Centuries before the tomb would finally empty, Elijah's miracle at Zarephath was the first crack in death's door, a hint of resurrection power. Time was of the essence. On Mount Carmel, Elijah was getting ready to face Baal, the Phoenicians' god of life and death. Priests in Jezebel asserted that their deity could restore fertility to the land. However, Yahweh had just shown his power over mortality itself, where it was most important. The home of a pagan widow became a living example of how Israel's God was more than just a food supplier. He was the source of all life. But there was a price for this triumph. As personally as he had once declared drought, Elijah had prayed to God for the boy's life. Even the prophet who dared to challenge kings had to beg for the ability to rise from the dead. Later, when he would bow low in prayer before fire descended from heaven, his threefold posture over the child reflected that. Complete dependence, not showmanship, was the source of true power. Elijah's determination was strengthened by the boy's resurrection. What could God not do on Israel's holy mountain if he could bring life back to a Sidonian widow's house? The prophet brought more than just his staff with him when he left Zarephath. He carried with him the unwavering conviction that Yahweh's purposes could not be thwarted by any force, be it starvation, drought, or death itself. Baal's prophets would not be the only ones put to the test by Mount Carmel. It would reveal the myth that anyone other than God is the source of life. In that oppressive upper chamber, the stakes had been set. The deity who could respond with fire would establish himself as the Lord of life. Elijah had seen a preview of the resurrection. The main event would now take place in Israel. For 3 years, Ahab's scouts had been looking for Israel's troublemaker. They wouldn't have to search for long. With a challenge that would split history in two, Elijah would enter the king's presence directly, still smelling of resurrection. The drought was at its worst. Israel had become a wasteland after 3 years without rain. Mothers observed their children's ribs pressing against thin skin, while livestock bones bleached in the sun. Desperate, King Ahab paced his palace. From Dan to Beersheba, he had dispatched scouts to look for water sources, but all of the brooks had dried up. Then came the news that Elijah had been seen on his way to Samaria. The king was directly in the path of the man who caused this catastrophe. He met Ahab on the road. The prophet's face was lined from years of living in the wilderness, and his cloak was sun-bleached, making him appear nothing like a royal enemy. However, his words had a sense of authority when he spoke. The charge lingered in the dusty air. "You, Ahab, are the troubler of Israel." This wanderer blamed the king for 3 years of suffering. Elijah troubled Israel by disobeying Yahweh's commands and siding with the Baals, but I have not. The next bold challenge was, gather all Israel at Mount Carmel. Bring the 450 prophets of Baal who eat at Jezebel's table. There was no room for compromise or discussion. Before the famine-stricken country, Elijah insisted on an open battle between Baal and Yahweh. The conditions were straightforward. Whichever god responded with fire would be shown to be correct. Ahab paused. He could be humiliated in front of his people if he accepted. To refuse was to acknowledge fear. The order came from the king. Messengers dispersed throughout the region. Shepherds left their dying flocks. Farmers left their withered fields. With their robes embroidered with storm symbols, Baal's priests marched from the temples of Jezebel. Curious, desperate, or vindictive, hundreds gathered on the slopes of Carmel. They discovered Elijah standing by himself in front of the throng, his body dwarfed by the size of the mountain. The quiet weighed more than the pre-storm humidity. Unlike the widow's jar or the ravens, this was no private miracle. No crickets chirped in response as Elijah spoke to the people divided between two allegiances, asking, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him." They had been starved for 3 years by the nation's indecision. They were now condemned by their silence. There was a crackling tension. The stakes were clear to both parties. As the storm god and the master of lightning and rain, Baal was revered. On his alleged homeland, the prophet of Yahweh dared to challenge him. Carmel, however, was symbolic ground rather than merely a physical place. Before Ahab destroyed them, there had been ancient altars to Yahweh. Holy space was being reclaimed by Elijah. The first to go were the Baal priests. They started their rites, stacked wood high, and prepared their bull sacrifice. They chanted, danced, and cut their arms in frantic devotion for hours. There was no fire. Their fatigue was broken by Elijah's teasing. Shout louder, maybe he's deep in thought, or traveling, or sleeping. The crowd shifted uneasily. The God of their king was not responding. Elijah took his turn as the evening shadows grew longer. He used 12 stones, one for each of the Israelite tribes, to rebuild Yahweh's destroyed altar. After digging a trench around it and stacking the wood, he did the unimaginable. He soaked everything in water 3 times until the trench was overflowing. The throng whispered. This was either faith or madness after 3 years of drought. Answer me, Yahweh, so these people will know you are God, was Elijah's brief prayer. The fire struck suddenly. Not merely sparks, but a fire so intense that it ate wood, stones, water, sacrifice, and even dust. The heat swept over them, and they fell face down. The cry, Yahweh, He is God, swept through the crowd like the sacrifice's flames. 3 years of silence were followed by a fiery response. Jezebel, however, refused to bow. Elijah stood at the top of Carmel, watching storm clouds finally gather, and she sent a messenger with the chilling words, "By this time tomorrow, you'll be dead like my prophets." One altercation was over. Another was only getting started. Indecision paralyzed the Mount Carmel crowd. Under the quiet skies of Baal, they had been witnessing the withering of their crops for 3 years. Elijah now made them make a decision. If Baal is God, follow him. If Yahweh is God, follow him. No one spoke. Eyes darting between the 450 priests of Baal, arrayed in their elaborate robes, and the lone prophet, the P.E. Opal, shuffled their feet. The priests of Baal went first. They constructed their altar, got their bull ready, and started cutting themselves with swords and spears until blood slicked the stones. The morning turned to afternoon. From the sidelines, Elijah observed, his weathered face unreadable. He made fun of them when there was no fire, saying, "Shout louder, maybe he's traveling or sleeping." The priests worked even harder, but their God said nothing. The throng whispered. This deaf deity was the object of temples constructed by their king. Elijah gestured for people to huddle closer as the shadows grew longer. He restored the destroyed altar of Yahweh using 12 stones, one for each of the Israelite tribes. The stones, which each symbolized descendants dispersed by idolatry, fit together like a puzzle. The audience gasped when he did something next. In the 3rd year of the drought, he gave them the task of covering the sacrifice with 12 jars of precious water. They soaked the offering 3 times in total, filling the trench surrounding the altar with water each time. Each splash emphasized Elijah's risk. The prophet would perish a fool, or Yahweh would respond magnificently. There was more significance behind the 3 pourings. The land was depleted by 3 years of drought. Elijah was prepared for this moment by 3 acts of obedience: Cherith's ravens, the widow's flower, and the resurrected sun. The people were now put to the test by 3 water floods. Would they see at last? Elijah moved forward and uttered 34 Hebrew words in prayer. No self-mutilation, no incantations. Simple words with eternal weight. Let it be known today that you are God. Fire erupted from heaven before he could finish. It was more than flames, a superheated whirlpool that licked up stones, ate sacrifice, vaporized water, and burned the trench dry. Heat rolled over the crowd, causing them to fall face down. More that, unjust sacrifices were burned by that fire. It revealed falsehoods. Yahweh's power contrasted with Baal's helplessness. Elijah's quiet faith contrasted with the priest's craziness. God's decisive response contrasted with the people's hesitation. Elijah stood by himself in the ashes after the smoke had cleared. The altar was completely destroyed. Even the evidence of its miracle had been engulfed by the fire. There are times when nations shift. The sea was split by the Exodus. The law thundered in Sinai. Carmel was now enraged by the verdict. Elijah pointed to Jezebel's prophets and said, "Seize them." The people arose from the dust and cried out what should have been clear from the beginning. Yahweh, He is God. Their confession reverberated off the charred mountain as they marched down to the Kishon Valley, where justice finally flowed. But there was more to Carmel's fire. Where there had been no dark clouds for 3 years, they now gathered. With his face between his knees, Elijah knelt on the mountaintop and prayed as fervently as he had once done over a dead boy. He sent his servant to check the horizon 7 times. On the 7th occasion, a man-hand-shaped cloud emerged above the ocean. The drought breaker was on its way. At his command, the same God who created fire would now create rain, 2 impossible things. The sky opened and the people dispersed. Their faces were soaked by rain after 3 years of cracked earth. A few chuckled, others shed tears. Everyone was aware that they had seen something unusual. Queen Jezebel, however, received the news in a different way in Jezreel's palace. She drafted a death warrant while Elijah headed toward the city through the rain. Israel had experienced a revival. Persecution would now start. Everyone was out of breath from the intensity of the fire. The blackened scar where Elijah's altar had been, where not even ashes were left the Israelites blinking. The lack of evidence turned into 12 stones could not be instantly vaporized by a human flame. As word spread that Baal's priests had failed, hands began to slip to mouths. Yahweh had responded. Mount Carmel was enveloped in a thicker silence than the lingering smoke. At first nobody moved, but then Elijah's voice broke through. "Seize the prophets of Baal." It would be against Jezebel herself to touch the queen's priests. However, something in the crowd was ignited by the same fire that ate up the sacrifice. The bloodied priests were now being wrestled down the slopes toward the Kishon River by men who had hesitated just a moment before. They had been starved by the drought, but the fire inspired them. Suddenly, it started to rain. It was a torrent that, in a matter of seconds, transformed dust into mud, not the timid drizzle of a repentant sky. Mouths agape to catch rivulets streaming from matted hair, people tipped their faces upward. With their fingers digging into soil that hadn't been moistened in 3 years, farmers knelt in the unexpected mud. The rain demonstrated God's mercy, while the fire demonstrated his power. Together, they provided an indisputable proof that Baal could not control what Yahweh could. Today, Yahweh. He is God. Elijah's words, which he had demanded hours before, suddenly erupted spontaneously from the murmurs that had preceded the confession. Not everybody yelled. Some just sobbed, their knees giving way under the weight of their own guilt. Others held on to neighbors, muttering prayers they had not heard since they were young. The collective scream reverberated over valleys that had been silent for far too long, reaching beyond the slopes of Carmel. From the sidelines, King Ahab observed. Rain watched in real time as his subjects' allegiance changed, plastering his royal robes to his body. The man who had ordered the construction of Baal's temples now witnessed their rejection by his people. He opened his mouth to give an order, but nothing came out. Elijah had never been able to steal his voice as successfully as the fire had. As the rain came, revival spread. As they trudged home, families started smashing household idols. Children widened their eyes as mothers told them about Elijah's miracles. Their hearts were prepared by the drought. They were ignited by the fire. However, spiritual awakenings tend to be most intense right before the most intense opposition. Hours later, Elijah was located by Jezebel's messenger. Elijah stood dripping at Carmel's base, surrounded by joyous Israelites, not realizing that their spiritual triumph would soon be put to the test once more. The rain continued to fall as the palace servant delivered the queen's oath. "By this time tomorrow, you'll be as dead as my prophets." Once again, the prophet faced the wilderness. This time, it was toward Horeb, the mountain where Moses had first encountered God in fire centuries before, rather than Cherith. Now Elijah would require more than a miraculous brook. Ahab's persecution seemed mild in comparison to Jezebel's rage. Yahweh's prophet had been confirmed by fire from heaven, but the queen was not convinced. There would be no contests or altars in her response. Death within 24 hours was all that was promised. Elijah left the jubilant crowds. Puddles grew deeper across the land behind him. There were miles of harsh wilderness in front of him. The awakening of the people had started. However, Elijah was only beginning the most lonely part of his journey. As he disappeared into the mist, the rain continued to fall. Jezebel huddled like a viper, waiting for daybreak somewhere to the south, in hiding in Jezreel's palace. Elijah's guilt was the only thing that was resolved in her mind by the fire on Carmel. The actual conflict, which was against spiritual forces rather than physical forces, was still ongoing. Soon the same God who responded with fire would speak in hushed tones. Elijah's biggest battle had been against his despair, not 450 prophets. Behind him, the cries of the populace continued to reverberate. But silence, isolation, and the question that every weary prophet eventually hears, "Why are you here?" Elijah received the message while he watched a servant, panting from running, clutch a piece of parchment that had been sealed with Jezebel's mark and watch rain soak into Carmel's cracked earth. Hastily written words carried the weight of murder. "May the gods deal with me severely if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like one of my dead prophets." No court case, no royal proclamation, just a vow from Israel's most dangerous widow. Elijah slumped his shoulders. The same hands that had raised a boy back to life now shuddered. Hundreds had just declared Yahweh to be God. Now it was all unraveled by the threat of one woman. For the first time in Scripture, Elijah is described as traveling completely alone as he fled south toward Beersheba, leaving his servant behind. The prophet who dared to stand in front of kings now looked like a prey. Jezebel's strength was unrelenting, not magical. She worked methodically, killing Yahweh's prophets, 1 Kings 18:4, installing pagan priests, and subjugating Ahab to her will while Baal's prophets danced pointlessly on Carmel. She had a history, so her threat wasn't just empty rhetoric. She destroyed twice as many altars as Elijah rebuilt. As Elijah stumbled into the wilderness, the rain continued to fall. He had been on this path before with Zarephath's widow and Cherith's ravens, but never so desperate. He fell at a broom tree. "I'm no better than my ancestors," he prayed. "Take my life." The realization startled him more than his fear. This Wat was the man who raised the dead and summoned fire from heaven. However, divine victories were erased by a single human threat. Part of it can be explained by fatigue. Elijah was exhausted after 3 years of hiding, which culminated in Carmel's confrontation. However, there were more powerful forces at play. Jezebel threatened not only his life, but also his reputation. He had seen the Israelites vacillate between Baal and Yahweh all day. He now questioned the significance of Carmel's comeback. Ahab said very little. The king watched as the altar was destroyed by fire, but Jezebel continued to rule the palace. The throne had not been touched by national repentance. Elijah recognized the pattern. A brief awakening followed by a relapse. More than hunger or thirst ever crushed him. The wilderness made him feel even more alone. He walked for 40 days, following Israel's exodus journey backwards from the Promised Land to Sinai. Questions echoed with every step. Had Carmel been useless? Were the cries of the people real? After such indisputable miracles, why did Jezebel remain in power? Before answering, God allowed the prophet to exhaust himself. Elijah stumbled into a cave at Horeb, which is the same cleft where Moses used to hide. Exodus 33:22. God said, "What are you doing here?" Elijah's response exposed his skewed viewpoint. "I alone am left." He had forgotten about the remaining faithful in Israel, as well as Obadiah's 100 hidden prophets, 1 Kings 18:13. Exaggeration was fostered by isolation. Elijah's humanity was revealed by Jezebel's threat. The prophet who appeared to be immune to drought, starvation, and false priests now trembled in the presence of a queen. However, This was a necessary unraveling, not a failure. Horeb had to break after Carmel's victory. Elijah's public triumphs were not enough for God to define him. Elisha would soon meet the prophet who believed he was alone. The man would learn of 7,000 faithful, convinced of Israel's apostasy. Battle, the fire messenger had to listen to God in whispers. Jezebel believed that Elijah's power was terminated by her threat. Rather, it marked the beginning of his most life-changing experience. The journey from hopelessness to rekindled purpose passed through the wilderness rather than around it. God prepared the prophet to speak forever by temporarily silencing him. For every believer, the caverns of Mount Horeb continue to reverberate with questions. Do we serve God or the excitement of victory? When enemies continue to exist and revivals fade, can we still trust him? God's gentlest revelation, proof that fire from heaven isn't his only language, came through Elijah's weakness. Sometimes it is through our collapse that he speaks most loudly. Expectations had weighed heavily on the mantle at Carmel. Elisha would soon inherit the cloak Elijah had wrapped around his face at Horeb, demonstrating that God's work is never dependent on a single, unfailing hero. Unexpected successes are made possible by broken prophets. The rocks of Horeb, the same mountain where Moses was given the law centuries before, grazed Elijah's sandals. However, this prophet arrived to collapse in despair rather than to hear commandments etched in stone. Following Carmel's victory and Jezebel's threat, his journey literally and figuratively stripped him bare. In Beersheba, he left his servant. His cloak hung loosely. The man who summoned fire now pleaded for darkness, and his prayer, when he arrived at the cave, was startling in its simplicity. Take my life. His words were completely absorbed by the cave. There was no prompt response. Elijah's doubts were allowed to grow, because time was the only thing that stretched thin in that empty space. He had anticipated God's presence to be all-pervading and indisputable, like on Carmel. Instead, silence gathered around him, until the divine voice asked, "What are you doing here?" Elijah's response, which showed his warped vision, was, "I am the only one left." He had forgotten Obadiah's 100 hidden prophets, the 7,000 who never bowed to Baal because he was alone and exhausted. Being by himself in the dark caused his vision to narrow until his worries outweighed God's faithfulness. God then orchestrated a revelation. The first was a wind so strong that it split rocks, just the kind of sight Elijah might have longed for at Carmel. Yahweh, however, was not in the wind. The mountain's foundations were then rocked by an earthquake strong enough to bring down Jezebel's palace. However, Yahweh was not present during the earthquake. Then, like on Carmel, fire licked the cliffs. However, the fire did not include Yahweh. Then there was a whisper, so faint that Elijah had to cover his face with his cloak to hear it. "What are you doing here?" was asked again. Elijah responded in the same manner. Externally, nothing had changed. Israel was still hesitant. Jezebel was still a threat. However, God's approach had changed. Elijah's enemies were destroyed by earthquakes, but his soul was rebalanced by silence. 3 commissions were given, 2 for political upheaval and 1 for prophetic continuity. The revelation went on to say, "Go back, anoint Hazael as Aram's king, Jehu as Israel's king, and Elisha as your successor." God provided Elijah with a purpose greater than one man's survival in response to his desperation, not consolation. The 7,000 devoted people Elijah was unaware of turned out to be crucial. He was oblivious to God's more subdued work because of his loneliness. Yahweh kept the remaining believers hidden while he obsessively focused on outward triumphs. This realization changed everything. God was responsive for orchestrating revival, not Elijah for creating it. The prophet was only one strand in a bigger picture. He was destroyed by Horeb. Horeb's whisper demonstrated God's patience, while Carmel's fire demonstrated his might. Elijah was diverted from dramatic confrontations to steady investments by the cave experience. mentoring Elisha and rendering decisions that would have an impact long after he was gone. His greatest legacy would be seeds sown in private obedience rather than moments of public glory. Elijah learned from the wind, earthquake, and fire what Zarephath's widow had learned. God's presence isn't limited to spectacular spectacles. Sometimes he uses uncelebrated obedience to establish kingdoms, works most effectively through hidden faithful, and speaks loudest in whispers. Despite having a limp, Elijah left Horeb with assignments that would guarantee his impact would endure. God's question, "What are you doing here?" still rings true for anyone who has fallen from a spiritual high, not to condemn, but to reevaluate, to broaden our perspective, not to minimize our hopelessness. Isolation causes distortion. There is weariness. Whispers, however, travel farther than fire in caves of doubt. Elijah left Horeb with a new mission, to prepare Israel for the future, not to relive Carmel's victory. He would go on to anoint kings and train a successor to take over his throne. When the prophet realized his work was only transitioning, he realized it was coming to an end. The light of God's silent perseverance was too bright for the cave's darkness. Before his story ended, Elijah would see fire once more, in flaming chariots, not on an altar. He needed to train a successor and maintain appointments first. In ways he couldn't yet fathom, the man who felt worthless would become indispensable. 3 names were on Elijah's mind as he came out of Horeb's cave: Elisha, Jehu, and Hazael. From one-on-one conflicts to influencing history through others, each marked a significant shift in his ministry. He must have been confused by the first 2 assignments. Why would the prophet of God install foreign rulers? Israel's fiercest adversary, Aram, was ruled by Hazael. Jehu was a brutal military leader. Neither appeared to be tools of divine will. However, these appointments made clear God's plan. Ahab's household would be judged by unanticipated means. Elijah's job was to start things that would last longer than he did, not to personally carry out justice. Elijah's aging body was strained during the journey to Damascus. The encounter was brief but seismic when he found Hazael. After anointing the future king of Aram with oil, the prophet revealed the disturbing news that Israel would be brutalized by Hazael. Elijah giving an enemy the authority to punish his people was a paradoxical moment. But in response to Carmel's wasted revival, this was God's sober response. Israel would suffer the repercussions through those very alliances if they valued political ties over loyalty. The irony of Jehu's anointing was comparable. Unaware that he had been designated for kingship, Elijah discovered the brazen general encircled by allies. The oil on his head represented divine approval of the impending coup. Years later, Elijah's prophecy would be bloodily fulfilled when Jehu's chariot destroyed Jezebel's dynasty. These appointments demonstrated that God's wrath extended beyond supernatural fire. As confidently as prophets, he wielded warriors and kings. However, everything changed with the 3rd name. Elisha was a farmer near Abel Meholah who used 12 oxen to plow. He was neither a foreign king nor a soldier. Without giving a reason, Elijah walked up and threw his mantle over the younger man's shoulders. The gesture conveyed a lot. Carmel's ashes, Zarephath's fall, Lordust, and Cherith's dew had all been absorbed by this worn cloak. The farmer it now called Elisha, burning the plow, killing his oxen, and trailing after Elijah. His abrupt departure represented complete dedication. If this calling failed, there would be no return to normalcy. A significant change was indicated by Elijah's mentoring of Elisha. He now made an investment in succession after years of being a lone voice. They were father and son rather than master and servant. While others referred to Elijah as man of God, Elisha called him my father. The younger prophet was the closest to the miracles and saw firsthand how spiritual authority functioned in both private and public settings. 12. Israel's prophetic schools, which were communities where Elisha and other sons of the prophets preserved Elijah's teachings, were also established during this time. A movement was founded by the lone fire starter. These smaller circles guaranteed long-lasting change, But Carmel's spectacle had been required. Students took notes on Elijah's remarks, worked on their discernment, and got ready to carry on his work. One dramatic prophet would no longer be the center of faith. Elijah's last years didn't turn out as planned. No more national revivals, no more clashes with kings. Rather, he explained the difficulties of prophetic ministry to Elisha while they were walking down country roads. Whether out of devotion or a sense that Elijah was about to leave, the younger man held on to him and wouldn't leave his side. From practical to profound, their discussions must have covered topics like how to hear God's voice, when to speak out, and how to persevere in the face of adversity. God's long-term plan was made clear by the three anointings. Jehu and Hazael would carry out the judgment. Elijah's miracles would be doubled by Elisha. Elijah's eternal life was not necessary for any of this. The fire he passed on would be his greatest legacy, not the fire he put out. Elijah would soon make his final crossing of the Jordan. New hands would take up his mantle, the material representation of God's presence. Generations of devoted voices would follow the prophet who once felt completely alone. God's plans are eternal. Elijah's story wouldn't end when he did, because those three men were anointed. No servant is necessary, but every act of obedience reverberates forever, as demonstrated by the continuation of judgment, redemption, and prophetic fire through others. Elijah had been on this journey before, from hopelessness at Horeb to a newfound sense of purpose. With Elisha at his side, he now headed toward Jordan as the waters ahead swelled with unimaginable possibilities. Where the river met the sky, something extraordinary was in store. The last chapter would be about blazing transcendence rather than fading away. Elijah was always in Elisha's line of sight. His successor clung to the elder prophet like a shadow wherever he went, whether it was to Bethel, Jericho, or the Jordan. Elijah's departure was hinted at by the other prophetic sons, but Elisha refused to accept it. The waters parted for Elijah as they had for Joshua centuries before when he removed his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the Jordan River. Elisha already knew that Elijah had the same divine authority as Israel's greatest leaders, and the miracle confirmed this. The younger man committed every detail to memory as they crossed together on dry ground. From the western bank, 50 selected prophets observed Elijah's final response to the inevitable. Elisha's request, "What can I do for you before I'm taken from you?" was bold and humble at the same time. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Prophetic succession did not operate that way, so it wasn't double the pubes. He requested the right to inherit Elijah's spiritual legacy and the firstborn share of the inheritance under Mosaic. Not about being worthy. And Elijah's answer was cryptic. "You've asked a difficult thing, yet if you see me when I'm taken, it will be yours. Those who faithfully watch until the very end receive God's gifts." When it occurred, the desert east of Jericho was scorched by the midday sun. Elijah strode forward, his cloak billowing in the arid breeze. Suddenly between them, horses and fire chariots materialized, not metaphors, but actual representations of God's celestial army. Mentor and student, earth and heaven, were divided by the blinding barrier. Elijah entered the tornado, his body engulfed in the flaming rise. Elisha didn't turn away or blink. He continued to watch as Elijah was completely consumed by the flames, leaving behind only the sound of hooves and a blank sky. Like a purposeful handoff, the mantle floated down by itself and landed at Elisha's feet. He picked it up. It was his to use, but the folds and wool were the same. The doubters on the other side of the river would require evidence. Elisha went back to the Jordan, threw Elijah's cloak at the water and cried out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The river split once more. The prophets who watched bowed. The delegation of power was finished. Elijah's ministry had been bookended by fire, which had first brought it down on Carmel and was now rising in it. The chariots represented how God had always surrounded his prophet and served as more than just a means of transportation. God's power was demonstrated by fire at Carmel. Elijah was shielded from earthly deterioration in this instance. The same God who raised a widow's son from the dead and fed him ravens wouldn't let him die in a regular grave. However, Elisha's ritual of mourning revealed a persistent lack of faith. As a sign of death-related grief, he tore his clothes. Maybe a part of him thought Elijah would return and continue to guide him. However, the ripped clothing also represented acceptance. He was now alone with the burden of prophecy. Elisha must have thought back on their years together that night while he was by himself in his tent. The hushed teachings, the silent prayers, the way Elijah's hands shook after Carmel. Now, one mystery was resolved by the chariots, but another was brought about. The fact that Elijah's body never turned up again fueled conjecture. Like Enoch, had God taken him straight to heaven? According to Jewish tradition, Malachi's prophecy meant that Elijah would return before the Messiah. Later on, even Jesus' followers would inquire as to whether Elijah had to come first. The ambiguity kept Israel on guard. Or Elijah's departure was an expansion rather than an abandonment. His legacy now permeated every restored altar in Israel, the prophetic schools they established, and Elisha's double-portion miracles. The one voice turned into a multiplied force. Elijah was taken away by God because his work needed to be carried out by others, not because it was complete. Elisha was holding a mantle that contained more than just memories. It contained unresolved questions. Had Elijah really departed from this world? Would he come back? The promise that lingered in the desert air after the fire that took him was that some messengers are too important to just perish. The story was simply changing forms, not coming to an end. With the cloak draped over his shoulders, Elisha strode back toward Jericho. The area where heaven had momentarily touched earth was covered by the Jordan's waters behind him. Lifetimes of labor were ahead. Elijah's absence ensured that his presence would endure rather than diminish it. The chariots had liberated him across generations rather than taking him away. Centuries later, Elijah would be discussing another exodus with another prophet who would be standing on a future below, holding evidence that fire still falls where faith remains. Israel's most unlikely immortal walked the skies for the time being. Elijah was never truly gone. He continued to reappear in surprising ways for centuries after being carried away by the chariots of fire. According to Jewish tradition, Malachi's prophecy, which states, "I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord," meant that he would come back to get Israel ready for the arrival of the Messiah. This idea permeated every aspect of daily life. Families await Elijah's arrival to settle theological disputes and announce redemption by setting an empty chair and pouring a ceremonial cup of wine for him at each Passover Seder. The ritual is an active expectation that Elijah continues to walk among us, invisible, and goes beyond simple symbolism. His tale had become a living hope that had transcended history. On Mount Hermon, that hope came to life in spectacular fashion. Elijah joined Moses in the Transfiguration's brightness when Jesus led Peter, James, and John up the mountain. The two ancient prophets discussed Jesus' upcoming exodus in Jerusalem, drawing a purposeful comparison between Christ's departure and Elijah's passing of the mantle to Elisha. Elijah was viewed by the disciples as a participant in God's plan rather than as a ghost or vision. His presence demonstrated that the prophecies were still valid. There are historical threads that transcend time. Elijah's lingering influence was heightened by John the Baptist's ministry. John denied it literally when priests asked if he was Elijah returning, but he spiritually fulfilled Malachi's prophecy. John carried Elijah's mantle in every way, the same camel hair garment, the same wilderness preaching, the same call to repentance, as Jesus' subsequent baptism. He explained, "If you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come." Even his conflicts with dishonest leaders were similar to Elijah's. Despite being 800 years apart, their lives served as bookends to Israel's spiritual rebirth and decline. Long after biblical stories came to an end, Elijah's memory was preserved in folklore. Stories from Jewish travelers told of meeting a mysterious stranger who worked miracles before disappearing. This person was always identified after his death as Elijah. He was described by medieval Kabbalists as resolving Torah disputes in dreams. Stories of an elderly man protecting Jewish villages from attackers were common during pogroms. These weren't just myths. They represented a belief that Elijah's disappearance wasn't the end. He continued to be heaven's itinerant emissary, intervening in unexpected human crises. The Judaism's insistence that Elijah's story go on is highlighted by the empty chair at Passover Seders. Children check to see if the level in their wine cup has dropped, a sign that they went every year. Some households leave their doors open for him to enter. This is theological tenacity rather than childish fantasy. If God spared Elijah from death, then he is still available for divine purposes. Every generation is trained by the practice to be alert for God's interventions in everyday situations. Christian theology views Elijah's return as typological fulfillment rather than a literal reappearance. In the book of Revelation, two witnesses, often connected to the symbolic roles of Moses and Elijah, prophesy prior to the return of Christ. Both traditions concur that Elijah's departure was not fatal regardless of how it is interpreted. His fiery departure ensured his continued involvement in the history of salvation. Sightings continue today. Near Elijah's customary tomb, pilgrims in Hebron report an elderly man guiding them to safety with helpful strangers could be Elijah in disguise is still up for debate among Talmudic scholars in Jerusalem. Unexpected assistance is followed by sudden disappearances in all of the stories, which always leave the helped party feeling more faith-filled. The legacy of Elijah transcends linear time. His life illustrated truths too powerful for one lifetime: the cost of facing corruption, the provision of God during times of adversity, and faith that endures beyond hopelessness. When discussing unanswered halakhic questions, rabbis refer to them as awaiting Elijah, having faith that he will answer them when he returns. Because they understand that some revelations require divine timing, believers approach mystery with patience rather than frustration. Malachi's prophecy remains unfulfilled. Beneath the surface of Christianity and Judaism, the promise of Elijah's return continues to pulsate. A story suspended mid-sentence is suggested by the empty chair, the full cup, and the whispered traveler's tales. Elijah was guaranteed to remain eternally present where faith and despair meet by heaven's sudden intervention in his life, rather than fading into history. Only two men are mentioned in the Bible as escaping death, Elijah and Enoch. Neither has a tomb to honor them. They both walked with God until they were taken. For those specially suited to heaven's ongoing missions, their infrequent departures imply divine exceptions. Elijah disappeared into flames and then reappeared centuries later, demonstrating that some servants are too necessary for earthly finality. His chariot ascent was redeployment on a timeline inaccessible to mortals, not retirement. This fact is attested to by every icon of the Transfiguration, every mention of Elijah's return, and the expectant silence of Passover. Some lives are so right that time cannot put them out. Everywhere people wait for God to step in against insurmountable odds, Elijah's flame continues to flicker. It simply left Earth's boundaries to work in ways we can only glimpse in passing. The story didn't end at Jordan's bank. Even after 2 millennia, we continue to prepare meals for him, observe the horizon, and utter his name when necessary. Where do you think Elijah will next show up? The story of Elijah starts with a spiritual and physical drought. Israel had to deal with more than just thirst when the rain stopped for 3 years. They faced the gods they had been pursuing in silence. Our seasons when heaven seems closed are reflected in Elijah's journey. Spiritual dryness is frequently a prelude to revelation rather than proof that God is not present. There is never any waste in the wilderness. Elijah was prepared for Carmel's confrontation by his solitude at Cherith's brook and Zarephath's suffering. Before putting his servants to the test in the spotlight, God trains them in anonymity. There are uncanny similarities between Elijah's time and contemporary faith crises. Similar to ancient Israel, we seek out solutions that leave us empty, financial stability, political saviors, and transient pleasures. These false havens are exposed by spiritual drought. Elijah made Israel face their misguided faith when he said there would be no rain. The same is true of our dry seasons. Dependencies are eliminated until only what is necessary is left. According to Levitical law, the ravens that fed Elijah were unclean birds. God frequently provides through people we would otherwise ignore, such as the unappreciated job, the surprising friendship, or the modest teacher. What festivals could never test, famine does. During times of prosperity, Israel's idolatry flourished. Its emptiness was exposed by Dr. Ort. Years passed before Elijah faced Mount Carmel. God's quiet fosters patience, the kind that endure when Baal's priests cut themselves for hours. Elijah's brief prayer was brief. Submissive obedience, not strong emotions, is the source of true spiritual authority. Because the widow gave first without knowing if more would follow, her handful of flour multiplied every day. There is a cost to standing by yourself. Elijah had to deal with a whole nation's indecision in addition to 450 false prophets. His description of their paralysis in "How long will you waver?" made me uncomfortable. Isolation is often a sign of moral courage, but clarity comes from solitude. Elijah was forced to express his desperation after being stripped of all pretenses in Horeb's cave. God met him in his honesty rather than chastising him for it. Carmel had been hit by the same fire in public, but now it was only whispering in private. Winning spiritually can drain more than losing. Even giants of faith encounter obstacles, as demonstrated by Elijah's collapse following Carmel. Loneliness is outlived by legacy. Elijah believed he was the only one who was faithful, but God showed him that there were 7,000 people who had refused to bow to Baal. Our sense of loneliness frequently warps reality. The prophetic schools established by Elijah and Elisha demonstrate how one man's obedience can spark movements. Monuments are not as important as mentoring. Elijah showed that multiplied influence, rather than individual accomplishments, is what truly defines success when he threw his mantle to Elisha. Heavenly fire still descends, though not always in the form of flame. It can occasionally be the reviving force in dire circumstances, the whisper following an earthquake, or the sustaining presence during a drought. Elijah's God is constant. Although the means may change, a widow's flour jar in place of royal provisions, ravens in place of Ra, in the faithfulness never changes. The majority of miracles start out as impossibilities. Mount Carmel moments. Those pivotal moments when we have to decide between costly faithfulness and cultural compromise, remain. How long will you waver? Elijah asked, a question that has reverberated for centuries. Droughts end when someone stands alone. When one person has enough faith in God to wet the altar before the fire breaks out, revival begins. What wilderness has prepared you? Each of us is asked in Elijah's story. Who is in need of your mantle? Carmel, where are you? The prophet, who started out as a single voice, became a timeless example of how one devoted life can change the course of history. Generations were to be ignited by his fire, not extinguished by him. For those who are prepared to light the match, that same spark is waiting. Droughts can end abruptly. Others keep going until they teach us a lesson. Even so, the same God who sent Elijah ravens continues to work through unexpected avenues. When we distribute the first portion, the jar of flour never runs out. When altars are rebuilt, the fire goes out. And for those who have completed their course, chariots continue to arrive. The narrative now shifts to you. There's a reason for your wilderness. There are others who share your doubts. Awaiting you is your legacy. Elijah demonstrates that when ordinary people trust an extraordinary God, they can live extraordinary lives. The faith to prepare for the rains must come before they arrive. Only where altars are prepared does the fire continue to fall. Our willingness determines what happens next, not heaven's. The journey of Elijah demonstrates what one obedient life can achieve. His story demonstrates how God uses common people to alter history, from drought to fire on Carmel. However, this is about your moments. of decision-making, not just about ancient miracles. When was the last time you faced Mount Carmel? Was there ever a time when standing up for what was right meant trust the same God who answered Elijah still answers, as long as people are willing to believe the fire will continue to burn? Elijah's legacy is far from over. Wherever people choose faith over fear, it persists. But the question still stands. Will you be the next